And welcome to the Ask the Assessor webinar. My name is Alex Hobbins from NQA, and I'm joined here by Margaret Rooney, who is one of the assessors at NQA. Just to explain the format of the day, of the webinar, I'm going to ask Margaret a series of questions that are common to the new ISO 14001 standard, and that will cover some of the issues that have been raised by some of the universities previously, and then Margaret will provide an answer from the perspective of an assessor. The webinar itself will be recorded and it will be circulated, and it will be available via the NQA YouTube channel. Before we start going into the questions, just to let you know that there will be an opportunity to ask questions during the webinar. We won't answer these until the end of the webinar. However, if you would like to type your questions into the question box, the chat box, then we will come to those at the end of the webinar. Okay, right, so yeah, good afternoon, Margaret.
Good afternoon, Alex.
So what I'm going to do is just ask you some questions that have been raised by some of our institutions. So to get started, one of the first common areas that is raised is, would you expect that the curriculum is to be considered under the environmental management system of a typical university?
Well, the short answer is no, we wouldn't necessarily expect that it is covered. The truth is that universities are at different stages of their thinking in this respect, and some are already doing things and will present it to us during our audits. But I would suggest, certainly in my experience, this is a largely underdeveloped area at the moment. So we wouldn't necessarily expect, but we're certainly very interested in what universities might be doing. I think my own view is the standards as they are written don't really lend themselves to curriculum. However, that said, there are situations, and I've come across this in my audits, where course leaders have taken a hard look at their curriculum in terms of things like field studies and long-distance travel, and asked themselves, is this really necessary? So looking at the carbon footprint, for example, of how you deliver your course is something that a number of universities are already doing.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. So moving on to the next question then. Something that's also raised typically is, are universities still able to limit their scope of the EMS to either a particular department or something like estates and facilities under the new ISO 14001 standard?
Right. Now, I know where this question is coming from, because the new standard does emphasise that you can't exclude something that could have a significant impact. So if such a request was made, we'd look very closely at what the limitations that are proposed are. I would say if it is to be limited to estates and facilities, I think that's fine, because in truth, an EMS is driven by estates and facilities. So if you wanted to limit the scope to that, I think that's absolutely fine. If it was a completely different part of the university, I think we'd have to look at each case on its merits and determine whether they had sufficient influence over the impacts.
Okay, perfect. Another question that's been raised is, do private finance initiative buildings, so PFI buildings, do they have to be included within the scope of an environmental management system?
Right, tricky one this. I suppose the bottom line is it depends what the university wants to do. I wouldn't pretend to be an expert in PFI, so I think we need to look very closely at what is the relationship between the university and the other organisation. But I think the question really is, or the university needs to ask itself, how much influence does the university have over the environmental impacts of that building? And if they have a significant influence, then it would be appropriate to include it in the scope. If it's a very arm's length relationship and the university has little or no influence on the impacts, then it would be wise to exclude it from the scope. As a certification body, if we're looking at buildings that are excluded from the scope, and a case in point might be, I know that some halls of residence are no longer directly managed by a university. I think it's got to be clear in the scope of the certified system precisely what is in. So in other words, the scope of the 14001 system shouldn't give the impression that everything is included if in fact there are some elements that are not included. That would need to be made clear.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so moving on, a question raised is the Director of Estates considered as the appropriate person to sign the environmental policy if the scope of the EMS covers all activities, products and services?
Right. Well, again, the bottom line is the system effective? Is it working? And if it is, then clearly the person who signed the policy is having the right influence. Estates are key to the effectiveness of an EMS. It really doesn't matter who's leading or signing the policy or whatever. If you don't have estates and facilities on your side and being effective, you won't have an effective EMS. So, if possible, clearly it is best that the person, the most senior person involved, does sign the policy. But again, we look closely at the scope of the system, the boundaries of the scope, and ultimately, is it effective?
Okay. Well, that kind of leads on quite nicely to the next question, which is kind of what level of top management would you expect to speak to during the audit? Right.
I can say straight away from my experience that universities have always been very cooperative and very good at identifying the senior people and making them available. I don't think we've ever had any difficulty in doing that, and that's anything up to Vice Chancellor level. We have on occasions been able to talk to. I think we have to be pragmatic about this. I mean, if possible, we like to talk with the person who's ultimately responsible for the environmental management system. It might be a Vice Chancellor, it might be a Deputy Vice Chancellor, it might be Head of Estates and Facilities, Head of Finance. It depends on the university's governance structure for the EMS. So I think we need to be pragmatic. It might be most universities have some sort of environmental committee. It could be the chair of that committee. If people are not immediately available, there's always the documentation, the minutes, the resolutions that have been passed and so forth. They will all give you an indication of the involvement that the more senior people have. I have on occasions been told that the most senior person is overseas, or will be back in a day or two, and been able to speak to that person by phone. So, provided the university can show reasonable evidence of the involvement.
Okay, perfect. So the next question looks at a slightly different element, looks at interested parties. So to what extent will interested parties have to be involved in the environmental management system?
They don't necessarily have to be involved because they are just that, interested parties. The system requirements are that you take account of your interested parties. And you will have to do that in your communications, in your assessment of your aspects. So they're not directly involved, but you need to consider their needs. So you take their expectations into account, but they wouldn't necessarily have to be directly involved. So just again thinking of the university context, interested parties are likely to be students, academic staff, Department for Education, the funding bodies. They're all going to be important interested parties, but you wouldn't expect them to be directly involved in your management system.
Okay. So one of the other questions then was, what are the most creative methods that you have come across in regards to effectively communicating the EMS to academic staff and students?
Right, that was an interesting question. Creative methods. I'm glad I had a few days to think on this one. The methods that we commonly come across are the ones that you would expect: newsletters, emails, website, and universities, I believe, do really good communication around monthly newsletters or termly newsletters or whatever. So those do seem to me to be effective. A lot of universities have, they call it the Green League, the internal.
Green Impact.
Green Impact, thank you.
Yeah.
A lot of universities using Green Impact and using it very effectively from what I can see, and that certainly gets other people involved, particularly students, and that's been a good mechanism, I think, to make people aware of the environment generally, as well as the EMS. I think that perhaps one of the most impressive arrangements I've come across is a particular university. I won't mention them because I haven't cleared it with them in advance of today, but I have come across a situation where the environmental management team has had a group of student environmental champions, and those champions have communicated directly with students, gone into the halls of residence, gone to where students are and communicated directly, and that was very, very effective. That worked extremely well. The university in question had, well, really done two things: put resource into doing this, and had clearly been very well organised about doing that. So that's one of the more impressive examples that I've come across.
Okay, yeah, brilliant. So have there been any kind of standout examples of good practice during audits that you could share?
I've always been very impressed by universities' governance of their EMS. There's always a very clear decision-making hierarchy. There's always a very clear committee structure that works. Now, I'll be honest, before I got involved with Ecocampus, the idea that things were managed by committees always left me a little bit cold, but within universities it does work, and I think that's because the culture of universities is such that decisions go through particular authorised bodies. But when a university decides it's going to do something, it does happen. So, you know, there will be a policy, there will be an EMS, there will be improvements in a certain area. It goes through a committee, it gets the seal of approval, ultimately may even go up to a university council. So that, I think, is a very good example that other organisations could learn from. I have also been impressed at the way that universities do peer review internal audits.
Right.
And again, I think a lot of organisations could learn from that. And generally, universities are very open with each other and share their experiences. And again, the peer review audit, I think, has really, really helped there. I sometimes find that a bit tricky because I go into university and they want to know how another university got on. Well, we really, one of the assurances we give is that of confidentiality.
Yes,
so
yeah.
sometimes have to be a little bit careful.
Okay, perfect. Looking kind of at the, I suppose, more technical issues then, is what are the most common non-conformities, and also just general issues that NQA or yourself find in the HE sector?
Do you know, I'm not sure that a lot of the common non-conformities are any different in universities than anywhere else.
Okay.
So I'm thinking of things like air conditioning and refrigerant management and the legal requirements around that. Universities frequently struggle a little bit with that, and that's very common outside universities as well. Waste documentation is a pretty common finding, and again, universities are not alone. Environmental incidents, perhaps having the full paperwork and a full investigation, again, they're not alone in that. DECs, display energy certificates,
right.
There are quite often issues around that. The assessments have been done, but there's some problem getting the certificates printed and getting them displayed, or we commonly might notice an out-of-date certificate on display. So that's just maybe because the building's been overlooked. It's been assessed, but putting up the certificate has been overlooked. So they're silly little things, but you know, quite important that you do encounter. Going back to refrigerant management in particular, this is where this gives, as assessors, we get an insight to the management of contractors. And again, universities are not alone, but sometimes I think there are weaknesses in the management of contractors, because you're reliant on the contractor to have the legal documentation available, and it's not always there. And this is where the internal audit and the environmental management team need to be very vigilant, to be aware what the legal requirements are, and make sure contractors are supplying that.
Can I just add to that question then? So would you expect, kind of under the new standard, that more emphasis is placed on contractor control in general? Or do you think that it was already...
I think it's probably fair to say the new standard puts more emphasis on outsourcing and control of subcontractors. So it was always there, but the fact that it's been enhanced, I think, should help in this respect. But I think it's fair to say that one of the benefits, if I can suggest, of an external audit is because we raise these questions, and it heightens awareness of the importance of contractor control. So those universities where we've already had those conversations, I think, you know, they do take that message very much on board.
Okay. Okay, another question then, which is, I suppose this has been answered already to a certain extent, but I'll ask anyway if there's anything to add. So it would be good to know, basically, if the audits often involve top management and other departments in general, or is it generally the environmental team that you liaise with throughout the whole audit process?
Yeah, we would always involve the more senior people, and certainly involve those who are responsible for legal compliance, or manage those who are responsible. Takes us back to the conversation we've just had. So yes, we would always need to talk to the wider community involved with the EMS. But as I said a few minutes ago, it's never been an issue getting to the more senior people. Particularly, again, you know, let's face it, it's going to be estates and facilities that are largely driving this. It's going to be a head of facilities, head of estates, you will always have access, usually always have access to that person. And then perhaps to a dean or whoever they might be accountable to through whatever governance structure that there is. Something universities are very good at insisting upon, quite rightly, is a plan for the audit well in advance of the audit itself.
Yes.
And that is because people are busy, so we need to alert them in advance that they might be needed, particularly, and we always just say, if we can meet with the Vice-Chancellor or the appropriate person, whoever it is who manage, who's ultimately accountable for the EMS.
Okay. So one final question from the participants today is, what evidence would you expect to see to demonstrate the link between the context, interested parties, and environmental aspects?
Yes.
It's quite a tricky one.
It is quite a tricky one. When I was thinking about this, actually, I mean, in the context of the new standard, if that's where the question is coming from,
yes,
the 2015 standard, actually, when looking at aspects and impacts, I'm not sure it's really that different. With the new standard's emphasis on context, leadership, risk, those elements were always there and should always have been a part of your EMS and a part of our audits. What the new standard does is make it much more explicit. So if we look at, I mean, the logic is you have your activities. Associated with those activities of the environmental aspects. Associated with those aspects will be the impacts. At this point, then, we're saying, well, how do we assess those impacts? Well, that's where the impact is going to depend on the context. It's going to depend on the interested parties, because there may be reputational issues there. It could depend on, again, with your interested parties, what the student body's view might be, what the regulator's view might be, whether there's legislation attached. So I don't see any huge difference, but it is going to, or should influence, how you assess your impacts.
Okay.
So one of the things we would look at would be, well, how have you assessed your impacts, and have you actually taken account of all of those things?
Okay, thank you very much. That's all the questions that we've had for pre-questions, if you like. I'll just see, are there any other questions that have come through? No? Okay. Okay, so I think, unless, Margaret, have you got anything else that you would like to add at this stage?
I don't think I have anything specific to add. I hope, and there's still, if anybody wants to quickly key in a question in the next minute or two, we're still happy to take that. But I hope that the answers have been helpful.
Yes.
And just in general to say, it's been really nice being involved with the Ecocampus audits, and it's been tremendous for NQA. It's been a great client for us to have, and we all look forward to doing more of them, and we have an increasing number of NQA auditors who would like to be involved in Ecocampus.
Okay.
So
perfect.
That's been really good.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Yeah, and again, thank you to NQA for providing the audit service for us. I know our clients are happy with our auditors. So yeah, I think it works well, and it's a good kind of collaboration. And I think one of the benefits of the audit process is that universities get feedback on what they're doing and whether they're doing things well, and I think that's important. It almost provides a justification to the hard work that goes on in universities, so I think it's very important. Okay. And we've had no further questions through, so we will call it a day. So I hope you've all enjoyed the webinar. If you do have any further questions after this, then please feel free to email them through. and we will send the webinar link